Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. The results are in. A majority of you listeners have voted for a single longer episode every week, with occasional bonuses, rather than two shorter ones. We'll be switching to this model in the new year. In today's episode, we are doing a Jatak tale. The Jatak tales, as you may have heard, are stories told by the Buddha in a time when most knowledge was presented far too academically and was basically inaccessible to the common person. These stories serve to spread the Buddha's message. We have covered some of these before. Check out the links in the show notes if you'd like to listen to them or read them. But there are hundreds more that we are yet to cover. All of these stories usually have a moral at the end. And today's story has one too. So without further ado, let's dive in. Special Agent Ishan Hawk urgently looked around. His leg was trapped, and he had still not acquired the target. A drop of sweat trickled slowly down his face. The floor around him was rigged with temperature and pressure sensors. He had exactly 30 seconds remaining to acquire his target. How was he going to get out of this? We'll soon see how he landed in that situation. But let's start from the beginning of the story. Special Agent Ishan Hawk was on a holiday. His last mission was an Inception style multi layered heist, which involved stealing something from some people who were themselves stealing it from other people who had robbed it in the first place. Mission successfully accomplished, he deserved this holiday. So he was holidaying in the kingdom of Magad, a kingdom that was well known for its local food and flavors. And that's what Special Agent Hawk was after. So he had flown down here to this kingdom to do just that, and to take in the local sights and sounds besides. And when I say he flew down there, I don't mean he took an airplane the way normal tourists do, because he wasn't a normal tourist. Special Agent Ishan Hawk was a bird. After a particularly excellent lunch, Ishan Hawk laid back on his branch, looking at the passing sights. He suddenly saw something that made him sit up and take notice. It was a pigeon, but not an ordinary pigeon. This one was richly dressed, and she was wearing a monocle. Obviously, from a well to do house. Hawk decided to find out more. So he hopped onto the branch the pigeon was on and introduced himself. Hawk, Ishan Hawk, he said. But you're a crow, the pigeon replied. I know, I get that all the time. I'm in the import export business, but I'm here on vacation. Tell me more about yourself. What's a fine pigeon like you doing on a branch like this? He asked. Oh, this is just my exercise, she replied. I like to get out of the palace sometimes. It turns out that the pigeon was not royalty, but she came close to it. She was the pet of the royal cook. That explained the rich clothes. Sensing an opportunity here, despite being on vacation, Hawk had an idea. To the pigeon, whose name was Kabutar, he said, I don't want to seem forward, ma'am, but if it's all right with you, can I accompany you back home? A short while ago, I saw a hawk circling overhead, a real hawk. And if there are two of us, maybe he won't attack. Oh my, goodness me. Certainly, yes, I'll be grateful for your company, she replied. The two made it back safely to the palace. They obviously did not see a real hawk. That had just been a ruse. Kabutar was gushing with gratitude. She offered for him to come in and grab a sip of water from the watering cup in her home, which was a basket that hung from the ceiling in one corner. Hawk immediately accepted and made pleasant conversation, at least until after the cook had entered the room and noticed him. He said his goodbyes and offered to escort her again the next day. Kabutar loved his company, and not suspecting anything sinister, she gladly accepted. This went on for a few days. The cook, now acclimatized to the crow's presence, hung up a second basket next to the first. All was going according to Hawk's grand plan. You see, Hawk had heard that the best food in Magad was prepared in the palace. He was not content with feeding off of the scraps of food outside restaurants and near picnic tables. He was Special Agent Hawk, a real connoisseur of food. He preferred his sherbet shaken, not stirred, and he could tell the difference between the two. Nothing but the best would do for him. He gladly moved in to the basket. It was a nice, cozy place, and Kabutar was especially friendly towards him. He was friendly back, not because she was a nice bird, but because she was a means to his end goal. He wanted to eat off of the royal menu. In particular, he had heard of gulab jamuns. Unfortunately for him, nobody ever accidentally dropped a gulab jamun in any outdoor dining areas or picnic benches. But now, he was closer than ever before to tasting them. The problem was, his very first attempt would have to succeed, and he would have to do it when Kabutar was not around, or she might raise the alarm. He would have to sneak into the kitchen, which thankfully was right next door. But he would need a diversion to get watchful eyes out of the way. Years of espionage training and practice kicked into high gear in his mind. He did a perimeter scan with some fancy gadgetry and secretly worked on blueprints when Kabutar was sleeping. Both the cook's room, where the baskets were hung, as well as the kitchen, seemed full of pots and pans, which seemed sensitive to any weight that might drop on them, even something as light as a drop of water. Probably, the noise of the falling weight would be amplified by the shape of the vessel. it was also possible that the pans would clatter and make loud noises if slightly displaced. What's more, there were several pots and pans hanging from the ceiling, and if he flapped his wings, it's likely that they would sway and clang against each other. There were hundreds of ways that this could go wrong, he thought. This is a well planned security system. He decided that the only way to go about grabbing a gulab jamun from the kitchen was to do it without flying. He would have to lower himself down from the ceiling. He had been accompanying Kabutar every day on her run, but he would have to find an excuse to sit it out the next time gulab jamuns got made. He waited for just such a day, and when he spied that delectable dessert on the menu for the next day, he set his plan in motion. He worked all night to get prepared, and the next morning, he did not even have to act tired. He was exhausted. Kabutar was visibly worried. "Oh, poor you," she said. "You look terribly exhausted. I should probably stay back to take care of you." But Hawk had planned for that possibility. "You must go, sister," he said. "Please get me some medicine on your way back. And don't cut short your exercise. If I had simply been exercising before coming here, I would not be sick today." That convinced her. The moment she flew out of the window, Hawk began to get out a long piece of string that he had hidden in his basket. He dropped softly to the ground, careful not to flap his wings. He got to the vent quickly. He found a place to secure one end of the string, tied the other to his leg, and began lowering himself gently into the kitchen. He had carefully built timetables of all the comings and goings, so he knew that he had exactly 5 minutes before the cook was scheduled to return from his bath. The gulab jamun smell was tantalizingly close now. He saw a big pot, a cauldron, in which they were slowly cooking, kept warm in their sweet syrup by a smouldering fire. As he lowered himself, the string suddenly caught on something. The other end of the string tightened around his ankle and cut deep. He stifled a cry. He could not be discovered now. A bead of perspiration trickled down his face and almost to the end of his beak. Underneath him was a pot of water, with enough water to cause the loudest noise if the drop of sweat were to fall in. He was running out of time. He could not flap his wings. He could not drop to the ground. He could not cut the rope. But what could he do now? This was enough to drive him cuckoo. Cuckoo. Wait a minute. The cuckoo clock. If he could just adjust his position, the cuckoo from the clock would pop out and give him just the tiny bit of momentum he needed to swing in the right direction away from the pot. Quickly, he pulled out his Swiss Army knife and started cutting at the string. He had timed it perfectly. Just as he cut away the last strand of the rope, the cuckoo clock popped out and changed his trajectory just a little, so that instead of falling into the pot of water and making a loud noise, he landed perfectly on the rim of the gulab jamun cauldron. And he sticks the landing. That's a 10 out of 10. Maybe I ought to go in for gymnastics after this, he thought. He looked down at the beautiful desert with dreamy eyes. It seemed to be lightly brown to perfection. His mouth watering, he leaned forward to grab the best of the lot. And that's where everything began going against him. Maybe the cauldron rim was too slippery. Maybe he had lost his balance because his foot was still hurting from when the string had cut deep into it. Maybe he had tried to overreach and grab the largest of the gulab jamuns. Regardless, he slipped and fell right inside the cauldron. Panicking, he tried to flap his wings and fly out. Alarm or no alarm. But his wings were too heavily weighted down by the thick and sticky sugar syrup. The syrup was hot besides, which made it harder for Hawk. Finally, his loud attempts brought the cook to the kitchen. The king was very, very cross because he could not have those gulab jamuns now. He punished the cook, who in turn took it out on the crow. He clipped the bird's wings, still heavily soaked with sugar syrup, and tossed him out of the window. Well, in that shape, unable to fly and smelling so sweet thanks to the syrup, Hawk did not stand a chance. None of his fancy spy gadgets could save him from the predators that had quickly descended on the scene. Ironically, one of them was a real hawk. His last thought was that he still didn't get a chance to try a gulab jamun. The syrup, sure. He didn't have a choice except to drink some as he was trying to fight for his life in the cauldron. But an actual gulab jamun? He still had not tried that. As I've mentioned before, the Buddha used tales like these to spread his teachings. This one clearly focuses on greed. The crow had a comfortable existence with good bird food at the palace, something that is not available to an ordinary crow. Pigeons were kept as pets often, but crows almost never. This lesson should not be mistaken as discouraging ambition or out-of-the-box thinking. Morally, what the crow did was equivalent to stealing from the hand that fed him, and that's just plain inexcusable. The name kabutar is simply the Hindi word for pigeon. Check out the links in the show notes for other Jataka tales. That's all for now. In the next episode, we are actually going to cover Shurpanakha's backstory. After the last episode, some of you expressed an interest in learning more, and I'll gladly cover a couple of stories from her life. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. Thanks to all of you listeners for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.